Our speaker tonight is Dr. Ken Wolgemuth. Dr. Wolgemuth has a BS in chemistry from Wheaton College and a PhD in geochemistry from Columbia University. He spent 40 years working in the petroleum industry. He formed solid rock lectures to communicate the wonder of God's handiwork in geology. He's a contributing author to the groundbreaking book written expressly for the church, The Grand Canyon, Monument to an Ancient Earth, which is the title of tonight's presentation. Please join me in welcoming Ken Wolgemuth.
Well, I really appreciate it, Kirby, that I have the opportunity to come and share this part of my story of the Grand Canyon with the San Jose chapter of RTB. I want to give a little background of my own spiritual and scientific background so that you have a sense of where I'm coming from. I grew up in a Christian home, and my dad was a professor at Messiah College, and I was really, God was my creator since I could even remember. So in that process, I studied chemistry with Dad for a couple of years, and then I transferred out to Wheaton College in Illinois and finished a bachelor's degree in chemistry. And at that point, my advisor in the department advised me to go into the step called geochemistry. And I asked him what that was about, and he said, well, that's taking chemistry and studying the history, studying the earth itself through that lens of chemistry. So I ended up doing that, taking my first geology course just after my bachelor's degree in chemistry in the Black Hills of South Dakota. And there I was with hiking boots and blue jeans and t-shirt and getting college credit for it, studying geology. So it really grabbed my attention at that point. So I have transitioned from graduate school, taught for a couple of years, ended up working and getting into the oil industry, in which I've spent my profession now for about 30 years. I got into the faith and science community about 10 years ago, founding Solid Rock Lectures, basically to bring creation story to the church. And this picture of the Grand Canyon is part of that process. You notice that I refer to it as creation story, and we have an ancient earth, and we have a magnificent creator. One of my heroes from science is the astronomer Johannes Kepler, who was a faithful Christian, and he described that his efforts were to finding out that the chief aim of all investigations of the external world should be to discover the rational order and harmony that's been imposed on it by God. So he clearly recognized his work as worshiping God. From Scripture, we can understand that from Romans 1:20, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power, and his divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. So we have a chance to understand about God's character and his divine nature by examining creation. The Grand Canyon is the example that I'm using this evening, and our book on the Grand Canyon, Monument to an Ancient Earth, was a multi-person effort. All of us are geologists. There's one biologist in the mix, and most of us are Christians, but several were outside the faith community. And Carol Hill and Greg Davidson and Tim Hebel and Wayne Ranney were the editors of the book. I managed to keep my name off the cover by being a co-author and left others take that role. Greg Davidson was a key person in the process because he was able to take the writings from all of these 11 authors, and he had a sabbatical time window when he could take things, getting all different levels of communication and writing, and wove the whole story together into a coherent result. Joel Duff is another one of the speakers that's with Solid Rock Lectures. He's the biologist on our writing team. And it's been a delight to get to know him and hear his story. He really does well at tying together environments of deposition from geology with his biology knowledge. So the key question we were raising was, can Noah's flood explain the Grand Canyon? One theologian made a recommendation that I not put a question like this on the cover, because at one point he had put a question on the cover of his book and it didn't do very well. But I had two options here: to put the question there or to make the statement that we as geologists are convinced that Noah's flood could not explain the Grand Canyon. So I did a test at a Urbana meeting showing students a cover of the canyon, cover of the book, with both the question and a statement. And from that experience, it made it very clear that I wanted to pose it as a question so that our mission was to guide people in how we do geology, in that we do raise questions, gather data, and then go and seeking to understand the best inference that explains all the results that we see in geology. I have a series of about 4 topics here that I'll focus in on. How was the book inspired and received? Then about a summary of the contents that are in the book. And then addressing that question, can Noah's flood explain the Grand Canyon? And then finally, with the topic of how should the church respond to this magnificent display of God's creativity? So we'll start with how it was inspired. And it came specifically from this woman geologist, Carol Hill. She's a professor at the University of New Mexico and has done research in the Grand Canyon. So she was keenly aware of of how we understand the canyon as geologists, and aware that there was another view that was being presented by a group of people in the church community. And the result of that was 4 or 5 books that have been published by flood geologists describing the Grand Canyon from their perspective of Noah's flood, in fact, forming the Grand Canyon in about a year. We had a book signing in 2016, just after it was published. And so this is a picture of me and Carol Hill, thankful for the long 5 to 6 years of effort has finally reached a fruition, and we are here ready to put the book out to the public. The authors of the book, of which there are 11 of us, 8 of us were Christians and several were professionals with not being in the faith community, but they were very sympathetic to our mission. And so it was a friendly cooperation that they helped us, filling in some gaps that we didn't find with Christian brothers to do the writing. I was blessed to have funding from donations from the American Scientific Affiliation, from a grant from BioLogos. It has been endorsed and sold by Reasons to Believe. Funding from the donations made it possible to achieve a goal that several of us had right at the beginning, that we wanted a book that could be sold about $30 or even less, so that it was readily available to homeschool families, readily available to pastors and theologians, as they would be able to get the book easily, rather than a full-color book that would cost otherwise $50 or $60. So we had a fabulous book signing time there at the Canyon, and that was where I learned the process of getting a big stack of books. Wayne Raney was with us, and he had a big stack, and he gave it to me. He said, now you sign all these and then pass it on to Carol and then pass it on to Greg. So we left the Grand Canyon bookstore that day with 2 or 3 cases of signatures on there of those of us that were in attendance. The bookstore has identifiers here to put this gold sticker on it that indicates that this is an autographed copy, so that adds a little more oomph and a little more encouragement to viewers to buy the book because we've autographed it. Here's Greg Davidson again, chatting with some the folks that had come by the bookstore table. We even had the privilege of getting it settled as a bestseller in geology with Amazon. Now, I don't know if this lasted for a couple of hours or a couple of days, but we got a screen capture of this, so that was encouraging. Then the other area, and topically, it was a #1 bestseller in Christian Old Testament references. So it got that level of attention back there in April of 2016. So that was a real blessing. One of the best encouragements that I've appreciated and endorsements was from Kenneth Keithley, who's a professor of theology, and he particularly focuses in on the faith and science type of issues. In this case, he said, here's a resource that not only demonstrates the superiority of an ancient Earth interpretation of the Grand Canyon, but also testifies to God's grandeur and his providence. This is certainly a necessary textbook for any class on creation. So we've appreciated his help over the years. And he is the first theologian in a Baptist seminary that invited Greg Davidson and me to come and participate in a workshop. Sean McDowell endorsed it with this: the Grand Canyon books, an important and well-researched book. The authors do careful scientific work to show how the geological record testifies to an old Earth. Their work deserves a fair hearing by anyone interested in the question of the age of the Earth and the geological record. And then this is from a University of Washington professor of geology, David Montgomery, and he's the author of a book that is The Rocks Don't Lie, a geologist investigates Noah's flood. And he comments, the book allows this marvelous landform to tell its own story, walking the reader through an illustrated guide to the geologic trail exposed in the canyon walls. It is a must-read for anyone interested in the direct testimony of creation itself on the history of the world. In particular, I appreciated and noted that he actually put creation with a capital C. And I had no particular awareness that he is in the faith community. We didn't talk too much about that because I appreciated his interaction with us and his willingness to give us an endorsement. There are flood geologists that provide trips down through the canyon for Christians, and they take them. And I'll comment about some of the things that they tell those that ride the canyon. In addition, up at the rim of the canyon, here's an organization called Providing a Creationist Perspective with the name of A Different View Tours. That is a different view of the Grand Canyon, apart from what we understand from modern geology that sticks with the laws of physics and chemistry that God created into his world. This comment really touched me significantly as I read it and each time I reread it. Growing up as a young Earth creationist, I thought Noah's flood carved the Grand Canyon just a few thousand years ago. I feel liberated from that view now and would enjoy seeing and savoring the canyon firsthand. I am so very grateful to the authors for writing this book, for sharing their love of the Grand Canyon and helping me understand that I can appreciate and study its wonders without denying the Bible. Very encouraging to all of those who were authors. As I published the book, I was able to get the religion editor of our local newspaper here in Tulsa, the Tulsa World, to interview me, and he wrote an article about it, and he gave it a title of A Great Divide. And he used the phrase that the Grand Canyon is somewhat of a battlefield for this age of the earth dispute that continues to go on in the church. And he wrote a very gracious article, so I was able to get this into the Tulsa paper. Now, I want to go through some of the summary of the contents of the book to give you an overview if you haven't gotten the book or looked through it previously. So our primary topic is we want to be looking at what flood geology is and what is its time frame. So we do that in this first part of the book. And then we add to that the time frame of modern geology as we understand it from the laws of physics that God has built into his creation. There's a table that shows the differences of flood geology and modern geology that has there about 6 bullet points, 7 bullet points or something like that. Here I'll just show a couple of them, 3 of them. Flood geology is the young Earth view of an Earth 6,000 years old. That radiometric dating methods of rocks are basically all flawed, and that Noah's flood occurred about 4,400 years ago, and in itself formed much of the sediments of the Grand Canyon and formed the canyon itself also, both the sediments and then the cutting of the canyon. Modern geology, obeying the principles of physics, the Earth is about 4.5 billion years. The radiometric dating methods do, in fact, yield reliable numerical ages within whatever error bars are appropriate for that particular methodology. And then based on the geological observations that we see in the canyon itself, a flood of Noah's scale just could not have formed the Grand Canyon. Or sometimes I think of it as my wife says when we talk to some folks at meetings, she says, "Where did Noah live?" Noah lived in the Middle East. Noah's flood was in the Middle East. So she's very good at just giving that little punch to people and say, why would you think it would be over here in North America? So those are the kinds of issues that come up. I'm going to briefly explain a few things about the geologic timescale, in that in the 1800s, those individuals who are noted for founding geology and developing it as a science examined fossils primarily across Europe, significantly England, Scotland, Wales, Europe, and Western Asia into Russia. And the names that are given to these are names from areas in certain parts of Europe, mostly Europe there, in which a certain group of fossils were found. And the Paleozoic means earliest life. Then Mesozoic means basically the middle life. And Cenozoic is more recent animal life. In that investigation, they were able to put the fossils in a logical order from the way they found them out in the field, that the oldest fossils were at the bottom and coming up through the geologic section. You can see that all of this area that is represented, the Paleozoic, are the smaller animals, hard-shelled animals, and an age of plants. The Mesozoic, Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous is the age of the dinosaurs. And then the Cenozoic is the age of mammals. That is the transition after the dinosaurs went extinct, that the large animals that we have on the earth today are mammals. I'll mention while I'm looking right at this slide that fossils and rocks that are of the Ordovician and Silurian are completely absent from the Grand Canyon. There are Cambrian fossils there, and then there are Devonian fossils. So there is a big gap of deposition. That is one of the pieces of evidence that that was not all made continuously in one flood year. The other thing I'll mention, most of the locations and names were in Europe. Well, here we have Pennsylvanian and Permian, Mississippian and Pennsylvanian. In Europe, these were represented by Carboniferous because those were beds in Europe that had a lot of the coal that was used to advance technology and mankind. And once that time period and those fossils were examined over here in North America, then the geological community split the Carboniferous up into separate Mississippian and Pennsylvanian from knowledge they observed and discovered here in North America. All of the numbers that are on the right-hand side here that give solid ages, those only came after radioactivity was discovered at about 1900. And then over about a 20-year period, geologists developed the radiometric dating methodologies of being able to interpret the ages of rocks from the isotopes that we found in those rocks. And that whole sequence gave ages from oldest to youngest. That is, it supported the fact that indeed all those fossils that had been put in a logical order from oldest to youngest, the ages were confirmed then by the radiometric dating methods. Obviously, a wonderful win for the geoscience community that those things could be worked out. So here you can see the carving of the canyon, and these might be a little small for you, but I'll circle this. And this is the Paleozoic rocks. And the flood geology community calls that early flood the first half year, the first 150 days of deposition of sediments from their model and the Grand Canyon area. And this whole sequence is the Mesozoic, that is the period of the dinosaurs, and they refer to that as late flood deposits. Other locations to notice the dinosaurs is that these little markers that have those couple of feet, okay, those are layers in which dinosaur bones have been found. Notice there are none down here in the Grand Canyon. For those of you that have been able to enjoy traveling as a tourist around Utah, you can identify Zion Canyon as a fabulous national park, and Bryce Canyon up here in the Cenozoic as one of the most beautiful national parks that I find because of just the beauty of the way Bryce Canyon has been formed. Let's see what other, those are the points I want to make. Yeah. Okay. When I teach Geology 101 to oil field people, I show this kind of slide in that the Grand Canyon is a fabulous display of about a mile thick of sedimentary rocks. And of course, the older ones are on the bottom and the younger ones are up on top. The geologic community, over the history of the development of our profession, has typically named individual formations for the convenience of communication. So each of these groups of different kinds of rocks that are shown filling the canyon successively have names that we can refer to talk about their origin and the history there. I show the two examples of the Coconino sandstone. which is that light band just below the rim of the canyon. And that's a sandstone that have features that we'll look at here in a few moments. And the other one that I'm going to look at is this red wall limestone right in the middle. And so I'll just name only those two to comment more a little bit. So part 2 of the book, then we dug into how does geology work, covering how sedimentary rocks form, covering issues related to the structures that we find in sedimentary rocks, if you will, clues from the scene of the crime, that is, clues of how this sediment material was deposited from what we know about the behavior of sedimentary materials, and then using the present to understand the past, because we see the physical processes happening today, and the laws of physics and chemistry have not changed since God created them. They're still stable. And so the behavior of sand and silt and mud is going to be the same in the past as it is today. Chapter 8 is solving puzzles of putting and understanding the sequence of what happened in what order. So there's a lot of puzzle solving in geology, and we have a couple of examples in the book to give a representation of how we decide, how we can delineate and decipher a sequence of events that has taken place. One of the most significant chapters, and you mentioned you're going to have Roger Weens as a speaker. And he wrote the chapter for us that talks about radiometric dating. And in this case, we titled it, So Just How Old Is That Rock? And here was an example of some of the rocks that are actually in the Grand Canyon that were giving ages back at about 1 billion years ago. One of the factors as we work through the book, when there are claims that flood geologists would make that do not fit modern physics and chemistry, we separated those out into these blue shaded boxes so that an individual could read the book and just investigate the geology 101, even if they didn't have a particular interest in the flood geology question that's a divisive one in the church. This is one of the good examples that I like to show, because the flood geologists make the claim that it is likely that radioactive half-lives of the long half-life isotopes such as potassium and uranium and thorium and rubidium accelerated dramatically during Noah's flood or in the creation week. Well, if that in fact happened, the Earth's crust would be molten if that happened 4,300 years ago. So this is one of those arguments that is one that denies the reasonableness of a flood geology model. This is one of the chapters that I was a co-author, and my co-author with me is Brian Tapp, at the time the chairman of the geoscience department here at the University of Tulsa, and he is a specialist in rock mechanics, or how rocks fold, and what we can learn about the folding sequence of rocks by taking them and examining them in the laboratory. And I'll make another comment about this diagram here in a few minutes, but that's the point is he was an expert in that. You can pray for me that I would be able to, even now, after he's retired from TU, to get back together and share with him he knows about my faith clearly, And I've asked him a couple of times if we can talk about faith, and so far he's said he'd rather not, but I'm friendly enough that I can ask him again. So, which I guess presenting this tonight sort of triggers me, so I may need to give him a call and see if we can get together. We have 3 different chapters about the fossils, those that are in the Grand Canyon and the Grand Staircase. There'll be ones of both animal fossils that are described down through the whole sequence from Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. A record of the fossil plants, and also a specialist in trace fossils, which those that are footprints or impressions in the top, say, of a sand dune that gets trapped in as more sand comes in and covers over those traces. Of course, we need to tell the story of our best understanding of carving of the canyon that we believe has happened. And the most reasonable inference is that it was a lot of time and a little water, that is the Grand Canyon being slowly eroded and cut deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper by the Colorado River. In contrast, the flood geology model is evidence that there were some very large lakes in Western Colorado and Utah at a time period for them, say 4,500 years ago, and that those lakes suddenly drained at the end of Noah's flood, carving the canyon. Chapter 17, we came to address the question, how old is the canyon? And the best interpretation that we have is that it's probably got started eroding about 6 million years ago, is the favored understanding, and then tracing the history of different stages over that 6 million year time period. Joel Duff, our biology friend in Solid Rock Lectures, looked at life in the canyon with respect to different kinds of animals that were discovered there based on bones and remnant materials that they left behind. We give a final part 5 of the book called A Verdict on Flood Geology. In particular, what we did there is that Greg Davidson and Wayne Ranney basically wrote a chapter and described coming up the South Kaibab Trail from the river and successively talking about the deposition of the different layers through the Paleozoic as you would walk up through the canyon. So that's instructive if an individual visits and they're there. And then finally a chapter wrapping up about science versus flood geology. Some of our bullet points. This book provides an accessible explanation of how the rocks and rock layers have formed over time. About half of the volume is devoted to this tutorial that is very understandable by practically anyone who can read. This is one of the best introductions to geology that I have ever seen. This section alone would make this book a worthwhile purchase, even if one had little interest in creationism. Scott Buchanan is a chemist, so he's not right in the middle of geology, but he found it to be so readable that he gave us this very nice endorsement. Okay, let's look at some of the issues about the Grand Canyon to answer that question or give points to consider in answering the question, could this have happened by a flood 4,400 years ago? Here's some of the comments that were made by a flood geologist. The canyon has basically 4,000 feet of layer cake sediments, which is true. This one individual says, looking between the layers, we don't see erosion or any significant channels. A second comment has been made in that the mountains have arisen since the flood. Well, mountain building of the Rocky Mountains, the Himalaya Mountains, the Andes Mountains, mountains in Europe and all over the world were all formed long before 4,400 years ago. It was a PhD geologist who actually said there's no evidence of boundaries between the beds. Well, this is the red wall limestone that's here. And here's the name down here in the corner, lower corner. There's been a 400-foot deep channel cut into it, and it's referred to as the Surprise Canyon. And in the canyon, those were filled in with different sediments after a land period of erosion. Initially, there are first land fossils that are down in the base of that Surprise Canyon formation, and then later marine sediments as marine waters came in over this area. The top of the red wall limestone has caves, and this is evidence that the red wall limestone was in fact exposed to a period of time of weathering and erosion prior to the deposition of the next layer up on top of it. So this is evidence of what we call an unconformity, a break in time when a land surface was at the surface and there was not continual deposition to cover it. The other point about the red wall limestone is that limestones are formed on coral reefs because it's calcium carbonate that has been taken out of seawater by organisms of corals and related type species, and it builds up a thick bed of limestone from tens of feet or hundreds of feet. The red wall limestone, I think, is 600 or 700 feet thick. So these are not flood deposits. Limestones don't survive moving water because the calcium carbonate gets dissolved. So these are distinctly growth in shallow marine waters. They are not flood deposits of transporting sedimentary material. The Coconino sandstone, they're near the top of the rim, close to the rim that I showed you. This diagram is showing that in this horizontal bedding, the beds are significantly cross-bedded in the sense that if this was a horizontal position, this sandy bed was formed at a time period where sand dunes were at the land surface in a desert, and the angle of repose of sand that is in the atmosphere can get up to 30 degrees fairly commonly, or even 32, 33, something about that. If sands are deposited in water, the angle of repose is almost never that high. It's more commonly up to about 20 or 25. So the fact that we see these distinctly brand new and fairly large cross beds is indicative that this was deposited under air in a desert, not underwater. Here's a comment from a flood geologist who has written a book and takes people through the canyon. Thick sequences of sedimentary layers as seen in the Tapete sandstone, the lowest of the flood deposited layers, are found. They have been folded while still soft very soon after deposition, indicative of all the deposition and the upheaval responsible for the folding being one event. This is the location that Dr. Andrew Snelling takes his viewers to explain that these were soft sediments when they were folded. The fact is, soft sediments like Play-Doh would not have folds and cracks and joints in them because the rocks are not hard. These rocks that are found today were in fact hard rocks when they were folded. And we know that because we can observe the nature of the fractures that are in that same fold. And in additionally, this axis of rotation of across the fold demonstrates that the sequential layers are all not 1 degree of plasticity. Some are more rigid than others. So there's variable. It is not all just plain old Play-Doh. It's sands and silts and muds of different strength. And that's clearly indicative that these were, in fact, hard rocks when they were folded. There's another look then of the Grand Canyon that I've looked at before earlier in the talk. And again, the flood geology view is that these are the first 150 days. And then the late flood are these that are from the Grand Staircase up here, which has the dinosaurs. So looking at the geologic timescale with the names, this is the flood geology interpretation, in that the beginning of the flood they claim is at the Cambrian, early flood, late flood through the Mesozoic, and then post-flood Cenozoic. If there was catastrophic flooding made these, there would be jumbles of materials together. There should be marine sediments mixed up with land sediments. I use this dramatic picture from the tsunami that hit the coast of Japan. Things get really mixed up. But in fact, the Grand Canyon is layer cake. It has different sediments that I've shown in the geologic section as I had it up on the screen, and that there were sandstones, shales, and limestones interbedded, but not all mixed up in a big jumbled mess. So that's what we see. Each of these are distinctly, here are some limestones. Here's the Redwall limestone. These are sands and silts. There's the Coconino sandstone up toward the top. Notice here that this is the Cambrian, what I mentioned with the geologic time scale. The Ordovician and Silurian are missing. So it's straight from Cambrian to Devonian. So there is a time, passage of time right there in the middle of the segment that flood geologists claim was all deposited together. Here's an example of a little segment that has an eroded valley, and there's land sediments in the lower part of it, and then marine sediments on top. So it's complex. It's not all jumbled together as would happen in one catastrophic flood. These are large animals that are reptiles that lived in the seas. And these are large animals that are mammals that have lived in the seas. So if all of these animals were in the seawater at the same time, they should all be scattered together in the sediments claimed by flood geologists to have been caused by the flood. Well, the reptiles are not even down in the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon has Cambrian to Permian. These are only, if you will, late flood period, not even in the Grand Canyon. It's more further up the Grand Staircase. And then all of the mammals are Cenozoic. So these two different kinds of animals completely which would claim if these were flood deposits, they should be somewhere in there together. But in fact, all of the mammals are only much later in their, God created them long after the reptiles had lived. So pictures of different kinds of plants and flowering plants with spores. And those little spores, if anybody had allergies and they wondered why they hurt so much, look at all those little spikes from the spores. That's what's so terrible about them for those people who are affected and influenced by allergies. So flowers were formed in the Cenozoic, where the flood was previous to that, Paleozoic and Mesozoic. These are all just from the Cretaceous and into the Cenozoic. So, of birds, dinosaurs, mammals, or flowers, if there were a catastrophic flood, they should be in the Grand Canyon. What do we find? We actually find zero. There are no birds, there are no dinosaurs, there are no mammals, and there are no flowering plants. So that just does not fit a catastrophic flood 4,300 years ago. Well, how should the church respond? Comment about that a little bit. If we are ministering to the body and to the lost, we need to get an act together of understanding issues related to God's creation. This is my wife, as we have exhibited in a variety of homeschool meetings and professional meetings, displaying the fact that we in Solid Rock Lectures can give creation workshops. And then later, of course, we had copies of the Grand Canyon book. In the book, we sought to address these issues, and we make these points as we display and we attend meetings with the book available for purchase. Can Noah's flood explain the Grand Canyon? We address that. And of course, from a geological perspective, the answer is no. Why are there no dinosaur, birds, or mammals in the canyon's layers? Well, and I've shown that in the diagram, in that they weren't even in existence yet when the sediments were deposited in the Grand Canyon. How do we know radiometric dating methods are reliable? Well, that's addressed in the chapter by Roger Weems. How can we tell what happened in the unobserved past? We can see of the evidence left behind, just as the detective does his work to sort out who might be the murderer of a victim from a murder having been murdered. How long did it take to carve the Grand Canyon? We seek to answer that question. And then we can ask a tough question: is young Earth creationism really biblical? And that you pretty much have to answer for yourself. If the church, or to want the church to be a good witness when Christian scientists are presenting data, do you think they should fully disclose all the evidence? My answer to that is a resounding yes. And then in contrast, how does it reflect on Christianity when evidence is cherry-picked for conflicting results and leaving out critical components of data? That's problematic. Scientists hear about this flood geology component, and they, of course, have no interest in participating in Christianity because of that confusion. This was one of the authors, a co-author in our Grand Canyon book, and he'd once gone to a talk. He lives in Albuquerque, New Mexico. No, I'm sorry, he lives in Flagstaff, Arizona. And he went to a talk from one of the Young Earth Creation organizations that was given there in his city. And his comment was, "I have never heard so much misinformation packed into a 1-hour talk, and he misused and abused my own data. Well, David Elliott is an atheist. He's an evolutionist. After sitting through a talk like that, it is little wonder he has a low view of segments of Christianity. Why does it matter? I would argue that the witness of the church is being discredited when material like this is presented by flood geologists that's just not true. And then our youth are really befuddled by the whole dialogue and the division, and many are leaving the faith. And it is not uncommon that they trace one of the reasons to these issues of young earth creationism. Many would eventually feel compelled to leave the faith altogether in the mistaken notion that science and the Bible are hopelessly at odds. Flood geology marches its adherents inexorably down that road. Science as described in the Bible, or science as described in the pages of this book, or on our book on the Grand Canyon, does not. We're seeking to support the fact that God is a creator with laws of nature that remain, and that we can have the opportunity to learn about past history by studying what God has made, similar to the invitation of Romans 1:20. Does it matter? It certainly does. Truth always matters. And there's one of those fabulous pictures that you just have to say, God is a magnificent creator. This is Horseshoe Bend, just a little bit upriver of the Colorado River from the upper end of the Grand Canyon National Park. That's my presentation, just about an hour. And now we can hit the questions.
I've got a question. RTB proposes a regional flood. Is there a stratum in the Middle East that can't be ascribed to a flood of the magnitude that is described in Genesis?
I've looked at some material in the lower Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, and there are some material. Well, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers do have deposited huge floods at various times, just because the nature of that basin, the lower end of the basin where it empties into the Persian Gulf, is incredibly flat. All right. So there have been some clues that there could be thick beds of catastrophic flooding events, but they're not consistently observed, and maybe they're not even heavily investigated, because it would take a lot of drilling down through the sediments to try to pin that down. And whether that could be established adequately, I don't know. But having said that, there's a geological feature of the Persian Gulf that has the following history. 15,000 years ago, when the ice sheets were across North America and Scandinavia, sea level was lower by about 400 feet, which means that the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys flowed the whole way down and emptied into the Indian Ocean area. And so those were a river valley that people could well, or probably would have migrated along and lived there, what we now know as Persian Gulf, because it was not a Persian Gulf 15,000 years ago. As the ice sheet melted in North America and Scandinavia, sea level began to rise, and about 10 to 11,000 years ago, the Persian Gulf began to form because sea level was now higher. And 6,000 years ago, the Persian Gulf was about the size it is today. So if people were living in that Tigris-Euphrates River Valley in that time window, now that would not have been catastrophic flooding in the sense of 40 days and 40 nights of rain. I know that. But it does represent a physical situation that if people were living down in that Persian Gulf area, they were driven away from it because of that rising water from that event. The other thing I have is, in fact, in one of the slides later in this file that I'm showing, I show a picture of the rain that fell over Houston during Harvey. Harvey was thick, heavy rain for about 5 days. And the rainfall rate in those 5 days was something like, I think something like 20 inches. I mean, it was, and just flooded so many things. If in fact God sent that kind of a rainstorm to sit on the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley and he made it rain for 40 days and 40 nights, that whole lower end of the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley was flooded and could be flooded with, let's say 15, 20, 30 feet of water. And you could look as far as you could see and there would be no mountains because of how flat that lower end of the river valley is. So that's indeed not evidence, but it's a clue that there's a physical location because God guides the rainfall. You know, poetry and psalm, I was reading one of them just the other day. It's God that sends the rain, the sleet on the earth. So at that level, I'm comfortable to treat it as reasons to believe that it was a local flood and it was catastrophic. Because I believe the Bible is true, there were events, for my case, the events of the flood were achieved that all that God intended them to achieve, that is the destruction of wicked mankind for their wickedness, saving Noah and his family, is where I come out. Does that help a little? Or at least I'm sharing my story, my convictions. The physics of a global flood as the earth as we see it today just doesn't work out in the sense that God would have to miraculously create gazillions of tons of water to cover Mount Everest. And the young earth community, flood geology community says, no, there were no mountains here there. And they make a claim for what is called catastrophic plate tectonics. Well, catastrophic plate tectonics is a computer model that does not fit reality because a computer model needs to be made with the properties of the rocks that are actually there. The properties that were put in for those rocks, they were no longer rocks anything like the rocks that make up the oceanic crust. They were just artificially changed to make the plates move at about 5 miles per hour rather than 3 to 4 inches per year.
So early on, you showed a picture of the flood geology and side by side to the modern geology of the Grand Canyon. It was sort of like a sketch. And then I got to understand that picture of the flood geology showed that there was a large lake covering a canyon that already existed. And then, so the flood geology claims that then that lake just dumped itself and thus exposing the canyon. I'm a little bit, I wonder if you can fill in the details.
Yeah.
How all of this happened and how is it associated with the Noah's flood?
Yeah. Well, when they make the claim of Noah's flood, of course, their frame of reference leads to a global flood. So water everywhere around the earth.
Right.
And then the first stages of that is the deposition of the Paleozoic and the Mesozoic rocks, supposedly in 1 year. Okay. Then as the water was draining away, these lakes, looking at the geography of the terrain upriver from the Grand Canyon, they have a drawing there that would represent a whole group of lakes that during the drainage process, those were large significant lakes. And then the barriers to those lakes broke, and then a lot of catastrophic flooding happened also to carve the canyon at the tail end of the year-long events. Well, a piece that doesn't fit that puzzle is that these kind of sedimentary materials, when sand is soft like that, the Coconino sandstone, if it were indeed soft, wouldn't have vertical walls left over because it would not have even been compacted and cemented together. So the whole trying to put the puzzle together, the puzzles just don't fit with what we know about the behavior of sandstones and siltstones and mudstones as they're deposited. And then, you know, they don't cement up in weeks. You know, it takes at least some thousands of years, you know, to be cemented up to be hard. So that flood geology diagram, let me see if I can find it pretty easily and at least get it up.
So in the very beginning, okay, there's a tiny little river there, but you got these layers already deposited, right? So the flood geology is saying that these layers are already there. They're the same layers as the one on the left, which is on the right, which is the modern geology.
Yeah, carving
exactly the same layers, right?
Yeah.
So then you're saying it's the lake above the Grand Canyon, then quickly dump its water through this thing and then carving it out.
Right? That's what their claim is, that during the drainage, these that are now represented by Canyonlands Lake, Hopi Lake, and Uinta Lake were a source of water to mean a lot of water in a short amount of time to carve it out.
Right. Now,
but the physics and behavior of the rocks themselves make that an implausible possibility.
Mm-hmm. Why is that implausible? Could you explain a little bit more?
Well, okay. If all of these sediments were just deposited in 150 days.
I see.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
The sandstones and silts would not be really hard, so that even if water flowed down to carve out some of it, they wouldn't be maintained vertically because they'd be loose material.
Oh, I see. So the walls of the canyon would not be sharp and jagged as we see today. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. And
the red
wall limestone is not even a type of rock that is deposited by water.
I see.
It grows in water. So,
mm-hmm.
So the whole concept of all the Paleozoic and Mesozoic as even being deposited by 300 days of, flooding water. Doesn't fit together.
Right. Now, on figure 1A, just right there, figure 1A, the flood geology shows that the layers are exactly the same as the normal, as the modern geology.
Well, yeah, because they're looking at the same layering.
Yeah, but how could that be in flood geology? Because my understanding is that they're claiming that all of these layers are deposited by the Noah's flood in that sequence.
That's right.
But how could that be, right?
Well, that's the whole problem. You detect it. You've just said it. How could that be?
In 360 days or 180 days, how could you deposit each of these different layers in that sequence? Because you would think, where are they being deposited from? I mean, where is the material coming from during the flood?
You hit it straight on.
So it seems like the problem is in the very beginning before you talk about dumping the lake through them.
Exactly. You got it. But remember, they are taking these stories to people that have no science background.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much for that discussion. I really appreciate it, Ken.
No problem. Somebody, I think it was James Stearns, somebody had their hand up.
I did previously, but I think you've kind of answered it with the assumption that by saying that the rocks were, by their theory, much softer. My question had to do with the physics of dumping thousands of times more water. I would think it would make a straighter shot to the sea.
Exactly.
Oh, okay. But it just didn't make sense to me that it would have those winding curves about itself.
The individuals, the PhD geologists that are telling these stories have pretty much significantly abandoned doing geology with logic, and thinking of the laws, the principles of physics and chemistry being consistent. They're telling a story that comes from basically the religious description that's there in scripture, and just embellishing it and say, well, this must have happened. And they basically ignore issues just like you asked, like where does it come from? Unknown. And the puzzles just don't fit together.
Mm-hmm. So, Ken, this is John Yu again. Continuing on that same model, it seems like it makes more logical sense, right? From the modern geology point of view, deposition from the earlier dates to the most recent dates, and then with the animal and body parts embedded in each of these layers, right? Now, if in Noah's flood, if these layers were somehow deposited, they should all be jumbled together, and you did make that point. However, in each of the layers, the animal parts are not mixed. They're kind of segregated by their time span, geological time span.
Yeah, exactly.
Is my understanding correct on that?
Yeah.
Now, I do recall...
Another factor is there are so many gazillions of fossils in the sedimentary section. All those gazillions could not possibly have been alive at that time 4,300 years ago, or there'd be animals piled on top. They'd be walking on each other on the land surface. There'd be no food. There's not enough food to eat to support the number of fossil material that's in this case, 4,000 feet of sediment, and the overall sediment section just tens of thousands of feet. So the whole paradigm of flood geology is just full of holes.
Mm-hmm. Now, I do recall reading some article somewhere from the flood geology that they were showing a sediment where they do have dinosaur bones or parts mixed in together with other animals parts from different eras. Oh, and so therefore they say, aha, see, they all existed together at that time. So was I misled in that recall, or were there actually some claims by the flood geology people?
They make that claim.
They do make that claim.
Oh yeah, yeah.
But where is that evidence?
I mean, the Genesis Museum has children riding on the back of dinosaurs.
But is there actual evidence? I mean, you didn't talk about that controversy there.
No, there's no evidence of that.
So, okay.
Yeah, there's no evidence.
There's another question here from Sarah.
Go ahead.
How do flood geologists explain the presence of limestone in the Grand Canyon?
They just waved their hands and they said there was grains of limestone material on the east coast of the United States, and catastrophic tsunamis had carried it across the country. So again, it's the physics and the improbability is it doesn't fit. The puzzle just never fits together.
James Stearns has his hand up again.
Yep. James.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, comment on what John was speaking of about the supposed intermingling of the different fossils in the sense of, I think that might have something to do with something they call the Paluxy man tracks. And this is something that John Whitcomb and Henry M. Morris stuck in their book, The Genesis Flood. And as soon as Henry M. Morris found out what the evidence was, they took it on faith that this guy, I can't remember where he was, but he had said, this is very, very compelling. And then when Henry M. Morris looked at the evidence, he was actually incensed, and they took it out of the second printing of the book. But it did get into the first one, and I think that story has stayed ever since. I was certainly taught it years ago.
Yeah. That location of Paluxy in northern Texas has been pretty much abandoned from the flood geologists because it's just too bizarre.
Ken, I think I was taught that there were many different processes that laid down the various layers. Sandstone, for example, you talked about being laid down by shallow marine layers, but also I understand wind can lay down sandstone. And you didn't really talk about river and fluvial.
River deposits, beaches.
Yeah.
Deltas like the Nile Delta, Mississippi Delta.
And don't those appear in the layers in the Grand Canyon?
The level of detail of beaches versus other, I don't know the magnitude that those are deciphered through the Grand Canyon, in the sense that the Grand Canyon is a location that we don't have oil and gas, where we really study and distinguish different types of sedimentary environments, or where geologists who are searching for oil have hundreds and hundreds of drill holes down through a sedimentary section, and they have measured the properties of those sandstones significantly. They can see where the better quality sand is that has more space for the oil and gas, and the holes are bigger for the oil and gas to move through. So that level of detail is not worked out at a location like the Grand Canyon, but it's tremendously worked out in the whole western portion of Oklahoma in the Anadarko Basin, where we have thousands and thousands of oil wells, or in West Texas in the Permian Basin. I mean, there are just tens of thousands of wells out there with enormous amounts of data. And, you know, how many other, you know, who knows, 100 oil companies looking for oil and continuing to look for oil. So geologists study those locations in enormous detail.
And are there any other questions at this time?
Okay, large canyons in the world. Oh, okay. Other large canyons in the world that compare. I know down in the southern Appalachians, there's one that's quite large, but not nearly as large as the Grand Canyon.
There's the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone, which is not anywhere near as big.
Yeah, that would be one. That's quite large. Other places around the world, I've not looked. I'll have to look.
There's one in Kauai.
All right.
But
yeah, it's called the Little Grand Canyon in Kauai Island in Hawaii.
Okay.
It looks almost like the Grand Canyon, except on a miniature scale.
But given the younger age of the Hawaiian Islands, it's
those were just before 5 million years. The Northwest Island is 5.2 million years. Oahu is about 3 million years.
But there's no sedimentation like there is in the Grand Canyon.
No, because those are volcanic. All of those are volcanic rocks. So it's still a canyon that's cut, but it's not cut in sandstones and siltstones.
But it's another pretty good counterexample to flood geology.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So Ken, is the canyon in Hawaii caused by the Noah's flood?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Isn't there also a big Grand Canyon in South America along the edge of Argentina or someplace? There's a very deep.
Well, I know in South America, there's an enormously fabulous falls.
Yeah.
Huge falls. I forget the name right now, but it's one on the border, I think, between Europe. What's that?
Iguazu.
Iguazu Falls. Yeah, Iguazu. Yeah. Hey, stay here. I'm going to call Helen. Hey,
Helen,
Helen. I can't get her yet, but stay on for the end. I'll bring her here.
I was going to say, Ken, back when I was in high school, you know, I was thinking about some of this stuff, and I grew up around a lot of young Earth folks.
Yeah.
Although my dad was not young Earth, and he didn't teach me that, but I kept hearing it from lots of preachers, and I was thinking about, is it true or not? And then when I was in high school, I crawled in caves quite a bit. I did spelunking. Yeah, and you should talk to Carol Hill about that sometime. I never talked to her about it, but it struck me, you know, crawling in those caves, that if that was all formed by the flood would have had to lay down all those sedimentary layers and then let it get hard and then carve out the hole to make the cave.
Exactly.
And then form all the stalactites and stalagmites very quickly, which, you know, and it just didn't make any sense that one flood could do all of that stuff.
It just gets worse and worse every step you go. He said, nope, doesn't work. Anybody else? Jim Stearns, are you putting your hand up a second time, or is it still up?
I'm sorry. I didn't realize I had to take it down. I'm sorry.
That's fine. Just
hey, while I'm here though, I'll give you a shout out if you don't mind. Everybody, Ken spoke twice at our homeschool conference here in Iowa, and it was every time he spoke, there was standing room only, and it really increased the traffic by our booth. We really appreciated when he was there. We've kind of gotten uninvited this year, but you know, that sort of thing happens. It's just depending on who is on the board, shall we say.
Yeah.
I think in all fairness now, we ought to let Ken go because it's kind of late there. It's so let me close this meeting with a word of prayer. Gracious Lord God, thank you so much for the opportunity that we've had to learn more about your wonderful world and the Grand Canyon from from a modern geology standpoint. And we can see that your creation is quite remarkable, quite beautiful, amazing. And as Ken showed from Romans 1:20, it's hard to believe that anybody can see your creation and not attribute it to your marvelous works. We do praise you, Lord, and thank you. And we ask that you would watch over us now as we continue on with our lives and go on to whatever activities we're prepared for the rest of tonight and tomorrow. We just praise you, Lord, in Jesus' name. Amen.